Max Verstappen crashing in the first qualifying session of the first race of the new Formula One era was something nobody expected. 7 minutes into qualifying in Australia, the reigning world champion touched the brakes for turn 1. And suddenly the brand new Ford-powered Red Bull RB22 snapped sideways, locked its rear wheels, spun violently, and slammed into the barriers before even completing a single competitive lap. Season just started. Championship favorite already out. But here is the detail that has engineers across the paddock extremely worried. Verstappen immediately said on the radio that the rear axle locked the moment he hit the brakes, something that should almost never happen in modern Formula One cars. Which raises a serious question. Did the champion make a mistake? Or did the brand new Ford RB22 just expose its first major weakness of the 2026 season? Because this accident did not come completely out of nowhere. Earlier in the weekend, Verstappen had already damaged the floor during practice, the car looked unstable in several corners, and Red Bull engineers were still trying to understand the true behavior of their new machine. And what happened seconds before the crash might reveal something much bigger about the RB22. Something that could change the entire start of the championship. But the most important detail about Verstappen's accident in Australia is something almost nobody noticed during the broadcast. But the crash itself was only the final moment of a chain of warning signs that had already started earlier in Melbourne. Because long before qualifying began, the Red Bull garage was already dealing with small problems that most viewers never noticed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would normally headline the news. But in Formula One, the smallest detail can reveal much bigger issues underneath. And Verstappen's weekend actually became complicated during the practice sessions. The RB22 looked incredibly fast on the straights, which confirmed what many engineers suspected after the winter tests. Red Bull had built a car with extremely strong aerodynamic efficiency and very aggressive energy deployment. In simple terms, the car could reach very impressive top speeds. But that speed sometimes comes with a trade-off. Because when engineers push efficiency to the limit, the car can become extremely sensitive in certain situations. Especially when braking from very high speed. And during one of the practice sessions, Verstappen already had a moment that caught the attention of several teams. Through a fast section of the circuit, he lost control briefly, ran through the gravel, and damaged the floor of the RB22, forcing Red Bull mechanics to repair a critical aerodynamic area of the car before qualifying even started. At first glance, it looked like a normal practice mistake. Drivers push hard during practice all the time. But the floor of a Formula One car in this new regulation era is not just another component. It is one of the most important parts of the entire aerodynamic package. The floor generates a huge percentage of the car's downforce. It controls how air flows underneath the chassis. And even a small change in that airflow can affect the balance of the car in ways that are extremely difficult to predict. Especially under braking. Red Bull's mechanics worked quickly. They repaired the damaged floor. They inspected the structure. And from the outside, everything looked perfectly ready for qualifying. But inside the garage, engineers were still trying to fully understand how the RB22 behaved on the Melbourne circuit. Because this car is very different from the dominant Red Bulls of the previous era. Those cars were famous for being incredibly stable. This one appears to be something else. A car with enormous potential speed. But also a car that seems to operate inside a very narrow performance window. When everything is perfectly balanced, the RB22 looks extremely competitive. But when something moves slightly outside that window, tire temperature, wind direction, brake temperature, or energy deployment, the car can suddenly become unpredictable. And that is exactly why what happened in qualifying raised so many questions. Because the crash itself lasted only a few seconds. But the moment you look closely at how the car lost control, it starts to look much less like a normal driver mistake. Now here is the moment that changed everything. When engineers reviewed the replay of Verstappen's crash, they noticed something extremely unusual. The car was still completely straight. He had not turned the steering wheel. He had not attacked the corner yet. He simply touched the brake pedal. And instantly the rear axle locked. Not gradually. Not progressively. Instantly. The back of the RB22 snapped sideways almost like someone had pulled a handbrake at more than 200 miles per hour. And in modern Formula One cars, that type of reaction is extremely rare. Because the braking system is not purely mechanical anymore. It is controlled by a system known as brake-by-wire. That system constantly balances the braking force between the front and rear of the car using electronics and software. But that is only part of the story. Because when a driver brakes in a modern Formula One car, something else is happening at the same time. The hybrid system begins recovering energy. When the driver hits the brake pedal, the electric motor connected to the rear axle starts harvesting electrical energy. That energy goes back into the battery. But if that energy recovery becomes too aggressive, it can behave almost like an extra braking force applied directly to the rear wheels. And if the system calibration is even slightly off, the rear wheels can suddenly lock before the front brakes stabilize the car. That instantly destabilizes the entire vehicle, which appears to be exactly what happened to Verstappen. The moment he pressed the brake pedal approaching turn 1, the rear axle locked suddenly, sending the car into a violent spin before he even reached the corner entry. From that moment, the crash was unavoidable. The RB22 rotated almost 180 degrees. The car slid backwards across the gravel trap. And finally, the front right side of the Red Bull slammed into the barriers, bringing out a red flag that stopped the qualifying session for several minutes. But the most revealing part came immediately after the crash. When Verstappen spoke on the radio, he did not say he braked too late. He did not say he lost the front. He said something very precise. The rear locked. That comment alone has triggered serious technical discussion inside the paddock tonight. Because if the hybrid energy recovery system or the brake-by-wire calibration caused the rear axle to lock unexpectedly, the problem might not be limited to one moment. It could indicate that the RB22 is extremely sensitive when braking from high speed. And that possibility becomes even more concerning when you remember something else about this new Red Bull. The car appears incredibly fast in a straight line. But that efficiency may have come at the cost of stability in certain situations. Which means the crash we saw today might not just be a random qualifying accident. It might be the first real sign that the RB22 is a very fast car, but also a very delicate one. And if that turns out to be true, then the race tomorrow could reveal even more about the true behavior of Red Bull's new machine. But the real consequences of this crash may not appear in qualifying. They may appear in the race. Because starting at the back of the grid in Melbourne completely changes the strategy for Red Bull. Instead of fighting for pole position and controlling the race from the front, Verstappen now faces a completely different challenge. Survival in the midfield. And that is one of the most dangerous places to start the first race of the season. Cold tires, heavy fuel loads, drivers still learning the limits of their new cars, and a grid full of teams trying to prove themselves in the first race of the 2026 championship. Which means the opening laps tomorrow could be chaotic. For Verstappen, the situation is even more complicated. Because recovering from the back requires aggressive overtakes, late braking, risky moves. But if the RB22 truly has instability under braking, every overtaking attempt becomes far more dangerous. Imagine approaching a slow corner behind another car. Dirty air reducing downforce. Tires overheating. And then braking hard while the rear of the car already feels nervous. That is exactly the scenario Red Bull engineers are worried about tonight. Because if the rear locking problem appears again during the race, it could turn every braking zone into a potential disaster. At the same time, the RB22 still has one major advantage: straight line speed. Throughout practice and testing, the Red Bull showed impressive top speed numbers, often faster than several of its direct rivals. That could help Verstappen overtake on Melbourne's long straights. But overtaking in Formula 1 is never just about speed. It is about stability when braking at the end of those straights. And that brings us back to the same question engineers are asking tonight. Was the crash a one-time calibration error? Or does the RB22 have a deeper stability issue? Because if it is only a brake map or energy recovery setting, the team may be able to adjust it overnight. But if the problem comes from the way the rear suspension, aerodynamics, and hybrid system interact under braking, the solution may take much longer. And that would be a serious concern for Red Bull. Especially because the rest of the grid looks extremely competitive this year. Ferrari appears very strong with their aggressive aerodynamic concept. McLaren looks consistent and confident after strong testing. Mercedes has arrived with a new power unit that many teams are already discussing quietly inside the paddock. Which means the era where Red Bull dominated almost every race may not continue as easily as before. And that is why what happened in qualifying today might become one of the most important moments of the entire Australian Grand Prix weekend. Because sometimes the first race of a new Formula 1 era reveals something that testing never shows. The real strengths. And the hidden weaknesses. And tomorrow, when the lights go out in Melbourne, the entire paddock will be watching one car more than any other. The Red Bull of Max Verstappen. Starting far behind the leaders. Trying to fight his way through the field. While engineers quietly watch every braking zone. Looking for the answer to the question that today's crash left behind. Is the RB22 simply misunderstood? Or did qualifying in Australia just expose the first real weakness of Red Bull's new machine? But there is one more layer to this story that makes Verstappen's accident even more intriguing. Because when you look at the bigger picture of this weekend, Red Bull did not arrive in Melbourne looking as dominant as they had in previous seasons. In fact, several teams already sensed an opportunity. Ferrari looked extremely sharp during the sessions leading into qualifying. Their new car appears very aggressive aerodynamically, especially at the rear of the chassis, and early data suggests they have strong performance both in medium-speed corners and under braking. McLaren also looked surprisingly consistent throughout the weekend. Their pace during practice sessions was not spectacular on a single lap, but the car appeared stable, predictable, and very comfortable over longer runs. And sometimes, in the first race of a new regulation era, consistency becomes more important than outright speed. Mercedes, meanwhile, arrived in Australia with a lot of quiet confidence. There have been whispers across the paddock about the efficiency of their new power unit, and several teams believe Mercedes may have found an advantage in how they deploy and recover energy during a lap. Which makes Verstappen's braking issue even more interesting. Because the new regulations have dramatically increased the importance of the hybrid systems. Energy recovery, battery deployment, electrical braking forces. All of these elements now play a much larger role in how the car behaves during deceleration. And if Red Bull has not perfectly calibrated that interaction yet, it could explain why the RB22 suddenly locked its rear axle when Verstappen hit the brakes approaching turn 1. That moment lasted only a fraction of a second. But in Formula 1, fractions of a second reveal everything. And that is exactly what Red Bull engineers will be studying tonight. Thousands of lines of telemetry data, brake pressure curves, energy recovery levels, rear suspension loads. Every input Verstappen made in those final seconds before the crash. Because if the cause is confirmed to be related to energy recovery or brake-by-wire calibration, the team might be able to adjust the system before the race. But if the issue comes from the fundamental balance of the car, the aerodynamics interacting with the suspension and braking forces, then the solution may take much longer. And that would change the entire story of the early 2026 season. Because this year is not just another championship. This is the beginning of a completely new Formula 1 era. New power units. New aerodynamic philosophy.